Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Hudson Library for our author event with science writer Amorina Kingdon. She's joining us this evening for a conversation about her recent book, Sing Like Fish, How Sound Rules Life Underwater. Before I introduce our author tonight, I would like to just mention that we have a very busy programming schedule coming up in September. I do have September brochures out on the back table if you'd like to take a look at everything we have coming up. We have some in-person and some virtual programs still at this time. And you can take a look at everything we have and register online at the library's website at hudsonlibrary.org. I also want to mention during the month of September, our Adult Services Department will be featuring a tour of China. So many of the programs we have during the month include programs that highlight the art, history, and culture of China. So it is my pleasure to introduce our author this evening. Amorina Kingdon is a science writer whose work has been anthologized in Best Canadian Essays and received honors including a Digital Publishing Award, a Jack Webster Award, and a Best New Magazine Writer for the National Magazine Awards. Previously, she was a science writer for the University of Victoria and the Science Media Center of Canada. And we have the Learn It All with us tonight. If you would like to purchase copies of her book, Kate is in the back. You can purchase copies after the program and have our author sign them, or if you'd like to have a talk with her, you can do that as well. So please join me in welcoming Amorina Kingdon.
Hello. Thank you so much for that introduction, Allison. I'm really excited to be here because I'm just so happy to have people interested in this topic because obviously I have been. So I thought about how to introduce where I was coming from with this book, but then I thought maybe the best way to do that is I'm going to start by reading a little bit of the introduction because that pretty much explains where I started with this and where I think a lot of people start with this topic. So, one summer day when we were kids, my brother and I threw our toy trucks off the dock into the lake in front of our house. We watched our miniature yellow graders and cement mixers sink 2 meters to the bottom, and then we jumped in after them. We drove the trucks around our lake bed just as we drove them around the dirt pit and throughout our forested acre in rural Ontario, expanding our domain into the aquatic. Between hastily gulped breaths at the surface, we graded pebbles in the shallow fish nests, bulldozed the pondweed in milfoil, used the digger to load silt clods into the dump truck. At one point, we tried to talk to each other and discovered that underwater, sound didn't seem to work. My brother sounded faint and garbled even when he swam close and screamed a bubble stream. My own voice was loud in my head, but he couldn't hear me. So inevitably, we spent some time shouting all the bad words we knew with impunity. I remember the rattle of my cement mixer's wheels over the algae-furred rocks was perfectly clear, but seemed somehow unconnected to the truck in my hands, as though the sound came from nowhere and all around all at once. When a motorboat passed out in the bay, the outboards that made a lusty buzz in the air were higher pitched underwater, like a mosquito instead of a hornet. And when Mom's wavering silhouette appeared on the dock, we didn't hear her at all. We could only see her arms moving, beckoning us to what we could only guess was lunch. Underwater trucks was fun for a day or two, but my brother and I soon hauled our dripping fleet back to the sandpit. We couldn't hear what we needed to, or trust what we did. We couldn't communicate, which is essential for a good game of trucks. That was when I first paid attention to sound underwater. Most people experience something similar, dunking our heads in the bathtub to rinse shampoo or frog kicking through a swimming pool. We notice sound is faint and distorted and apparently contains little useful information. We assume it doesn't work. And where we can't sense a world, it's difficult to imagine one exists. For most of human history, our own ears were all we had with which to listen, and human ears are not evolved to work underwater. So that's kind of where I started with this whole topic. And then as I was working at Hackeye magazine, I started getting more and more stories talking about sound underwater, and I realized that I really wanted to learn more about it. So that's where I went to. So what I'd like to do is share with you a little bit tonight about how animals use sound underwater and why it's so important to their lives. And to start with, I'm going to force you to sit through a couple of minutes of physics. I'm sorry about this. I know you're not supposed to start with math, but I promise it makes the rest of it worth it. So, what is sound? Sound is a pressure wave. It can travel through any medium that can compress even a little bit, or whose molecules can compress even a little bit. So air, water, even steel. So the wave starts when a source vibrates against this medium, like my hand just vibrated against this microphone. It knocks the molecules, which knock the ones beside it. And this continues on, and they return to their original position and then are pushed again. So this makes a pressure wave, which is a series of crests and troughs that spreads out even as each molecule stays in place. So you can see these crests and troughs, but each individual molecule is sort of staying in the same spot. And this takes place on the scale in air and water on very nanometers, micrometers scales, but it does actually compress the medium. So this principle is the same no matter what the sound is moving through. And when a sound is detected or it's heard, the amplitude, or what we would call the volume, is sort of a really rough mathematical equivalent of how far the particles swing back and forth. And that's sort of related to its energy. So I was delighted to learn little things like this. A wave, any wave, the definition of a wave is the transfer of energy from one place to another. A sound wave is just the energy moving through the particles. So a more energetic vibration, a more energetic wave will push the particles harder and move them further. So that will create more compressed crests and more empty troughs. And what that will translate to roughly is our perception of a louder or a softer sound, depending on how far those particles are swinging. And then the other main metric of sound that we kind of think about is pitch or frequency, and that correlates to how frequently the crests or the troughs arrive at what's detecting the sound. So in higher frequency, basically, these crests and troughs are closer together, and in a lower frequency sound, they're going to be further apart. And that relates to the speed of the vibration of the source. So the measure of how easily a sound wave moves through a material is this, I promise this is almost done the math, is its acoustic impedance. And this depends, for our purposes, let's just say, quite a very great deal on density. And water is a lot denser than air. And that means that these two materials, sound travels differently in each of them. It travels a little bit easier in water, in water. And when a sound wave is traveling through one medium and it meets another medium that has a very different density or a very different impedance, it tends to bounce off of the boundary instead of moving through into the next thing. So any sort of boundary between, say, air or water, or air and steel, or ground and water is going to act a little bit like it's going to reflect a sound as opposed to just let it move on through. So one of the other things, that's actually why we don't hear what's going on below the water, and why when we're above it, we don't hear what's going on below the water, and if we're in the water, we don't hear what's going on above it. So that's why my brother and I couldn't understand or hear my mom calling us to lunch. So it also means that sound travels faster in a denser medium, and in this case, it moves faster in water than it does in air. So if you think about it, this makes sense. If the molecules are closer together, the same vibration is going to send them knocking together quicker. The wave will generally travel easier and faster because each molecule has to swing less far in order to bump the next one if it's denser. So all this to say, in air, sound travels about 330 meters a second. Underwater, it travels about 4.5 times faster, and that's about 1,450 meters a second. If you could put your head in stainless steel, it would travel about 5 kilometers a second. So denser, faster. So what does all this mean for hearing in water? Well, because sound travels better than it does in air, it goes faster and further, it means that sound actually works pretty well underwater. But at the same time, it means that other channels of information work less efficiently for animal senses to pick up. So let me explain a bit about what I mean by that. So a sense is ultimately information that an organism can use to at least potentially make a decision. Senses and sensory organs don't evolve if they just give us information that we have no ability to act on. So senses evolved to tell an animal about their world, about what's touching them, what's around them. So they evolved these senses to know what they need to know in order to survive, whether that's to find their way around, to find a mate, to find food, to avoid becoming food, all that kind of thing. So the senses that we use and that animals use and evolve, they evolve to tell them something about their world to survive in response to the environment and what's going to do that for them the best. So there's proximate senses like touch and taste, which work about the same underwater as they do in air. Touch is still touch underwater. Then when it comes to sensing something at more of a distance, underwater, there's also light, so you can also have sight underwater. However, underwater, that density means that water actually absorbs light really, really well. So even in the clearest water below about 200 meters, there's almost no light at all. And if you're in sort of murky coastal waters around the shores, there's usually a lot of silt and a lot of plankton that gets stirred up. So it's actually kind of hard to see very far underwater compared to in air. And the same density of water also means that when you have scents, smell does work underwater, but chemicals diffuse slower through the water, which means that scent is going to get to you slower, and it's also going to be skewed a lot by currents. I guess it's skewed by wind and air as well, but it's not necessarily going to tell you super accurate direction. So underwater, the channels of information that are there for senses to pick up are kind of diminished a little bit, but sound actually works better underwater. So sound is a really good distance sense. Even in air, we rely on it very heavily. It's the medium for alarm signals. It's the only distance sense we have that triggers a true startle response in our bodies, and it's the most likely distance sense that can wake us up from sleep. And that tells you about the value not just of hearing itself, but as sound as a channel of information for animals in general. So add to that underwater, it's sort of turbocharged a little bit, and we see that in water, sound tells animals a lot more weighted than it does in the air. It's kind of a disadvantageous not to tap in. And it turns out that there's actually a huge amount to hear underwater. The ocean was never, ever, ever a silent world. So I think we can blame Jacques Cousteau for this one, but a lot of people have this idea that sound doesn't work underwater. Well, we can blame swimming his kids underwater and also Jacques Cousteau. He had his 1950s film, The Silent World, but that's just because our ears don't work underwater. In fact, there's a heck of a lot that happens underwater. This graph is one of my favorite. I can't believe I'm going to use this sentence. This graph from 1963 is beautiful. But it's beautiful. This was from one of the very first symposiums ever convened on something called marine bioacoustics. It was in 1963, and it was one of the first times that somebody looked at all of the different sounds in the ocean and put them all in one graph. And what you see here is different curves of different wind speeds depending on their Beaufort scale. So somebody went to the trouble of saying, and you can hear wind and waves underwater pretty much all the time. And as the wind gets faster, the sound gets higher, wind force in Beaufort. You can see these are the traffic noises of ships even in the 1960s. So even back then, you could hear this throughout the ocean. Then down here you have sort of bubbles and spray down here. Way in the corner you have molecular agitation, which is literally just the sounds of molecules existing, and not 0 degrees Kelvin. And then way, way, way up here you have very, very low, very, very loud sounds like earthquakes and explosions. But underwater there's actually a lot of earthquakes, subsea earthquakes, mudslides, volcanic activity around vents, that kind of thing. And then you can see up there's precipitation. All across there, it's a higher pitched sound, but they were recording rain. And interestingly enough, not only does rain make a sound when it falls on the water, but you can actually tell the drop size of the rain in a storm. If you have the right equipment and you're listening underwater, you can track storms across the ocean just by listening, because the characteristics of the sound created by the bubbles of the rain is going to correlate to the drop size, because it's going to correlate to the wavelength that it creates. This is the sound of snow falling on water. And it was discovered in Lake Cowichan in British Columbia, just about 100 clicks north of where I live. And I was delighted to find this. It was he discovered it in 1985, but this was published in 1987. is the background noise in the lake, and that's the sound of different snowflake diameters hitting the water. And apparently snow makes a really special sound when it falls in the water. Because it's frozen, it goes plink, and then as it melts, it goes ee! So he described it as like a plink screech, and it's just there's a poem in there somewhere that a better writer than I will write someday. But the ocean was never silent. There's always sound in the ocean. And you'll also notice something here called biologics, which was the old school name for sounds that all the animals made, which at about that time, nobody really knew who was making those noises and what exactly they meant. Now, just a little bit about why our ears don't work underwater before we get into animals. So remember I talked about that idea of impedance and shifting between mediums? So our ears begin with a vibration in an eardrum, right? And that's got air and air on each side. There's no issue of impedance. But when you put water on one side or you put a water-air interface, the waterborne sound meets an impedance mismatch and it kind of reflects off. So the sound that comes into your ear, it meets air from the water, it meets air and it just bounces off. And in fact, when we do put our heads underwater and listen, what we think is actually happening is that instead of going through our ears, the sound is actually being transmitted through the bones in our skulls into our inner ears directly. And that's from research that's being done at Groton, Connecticut on naval divers. But it's really, really hard and unethical to put a human head underwater and blast it with loud noise and then measure how sound moves through it. So it's a difficult study to do. But one of the reasons they think this happens is because if you put your head underwater with a neoprene hood on, it changes how the sound is conducted into your ears, even if there's something covering your ears or not covering your ears. So that's because the difference in impedance between water and bone is much, much less than the difference between water and air. So I thought that was kind of cool. So basically, our human air-filled ears mean that we just can't really tap in. But in fact, marine animals that don't even make sounds themselves can perceive sound just fine because they have different ears and they have other structures that actually do perceive sound. And how do they do that? Well, in order to detect sound, an animal only needs to somehow turn the mechanical motion of sound into the electrical signal of a nerve cell. It make the physical motion trigger an electrical motion. And there are so many more ways to do that than just what we do, or even just the structure that we call an ear. So I already said that, sorry about that. Meet the humble hair cell. Very early in the history of animal evolution, like way, way, way early in the history of evolution, the structure evolved called a hair cell. So in its simplest iteration, the hair cell is a cell with a protrusion or several protrusions or a bundle of protrusions sticking up, that when that protrusion is bent, it fires a signal down a neuron that's attached to it. And that's it. Now, these probably evolved many different times during history. There's more different versions of them and more different anatomies of them. There's books this thick written on them, I swear. But at the end of the day, the basic principle is the same. That's it. So this hair cell is found on the surface of many marine animals where it detects touch and movement and water motion. And it's also found very, very widely in organs that are devoted to detecting gravity. Now, how that works. To begin with, the density of a fish or a marine animal's body, an animal in the ocean, is actually quite similar to water. It's not like the difference between air and water. A sound moving through the sea will mostly move right on through fish and other animals, and kind of us too when we're in the water. A body is similar in density to water. They are quote-unquote acoustically transparent. So invertebrate animals like corals, lobsters, scallops, crabs, squid, and octopus, all these animals that don't have anything that we would call an ear, they can detect sound with the same sorts of organs that they use to detect gravity. And how this works is these organs are basically a chamber lined with hair cells, like here, with an inert mass inside. And as the animal moves up, down, and all around, and this mass of sand or stone or whatever it's accreted in there, it kind of rolls around and it physically bends the hair cells at a particular point on the inside of that chamber. And this sends a nerve signal to the brain and it lets the animal know what direction it's in. However, but this also means that as the sound is moving through the animal, it is also creating a differential motion between the hair cell and the inert mass in exactly the same way that movement would. And so that also allows animals to perceive sound. And in fact, this is what we know that squid do. And other animals like mussels and scallops can also detect sound with their balance organs called statocysts, because they're relying on the same principle of mechanical into a neuron. And in fact, fish hear. Fish indeed actually have what we call ears. An ear, it turns out, is any organ that's specifically devoted to hearing. So this wouldn't count as an ear because it's not devoted just to hearing. But fish actually evolved the first ears. We think probably sometime around 400 and plus million years ago. And these ears are nothing like ours. They're only called ears because they're devoted to hearing. They actually operate on this same principle. They have a stone inside, in this case called an otolith. And otoliths look something like this. And they look very weird, but they are in fact little stones. They're sort of like a calcium protein matrix. If you've ever seen them before, they're used a lot in jewelry and things like that. They accrete over time in the fish's head. They're laid down layer by layer as the fish gets older. And they're actually really, really useful research tools for oceanographers, entirely unrelated to hearing, because as the fish is swimming through the ocean, it's accreting these stones with the isotopes or the chemicals or the conditions of whatever water it's in. So if you catch a fish and it's, been around for 20 years swimming through the Pacific Ocean, and you take its otolith and you look at each layer individually and chemically analyze it, you can tell where it's been over that time and what water it's been in and what those water conditions have been like. It's kind of like tree rings. Yeah, I actually visited, if anyone ever has a reason to go to Seattle, there's a place there called the Burke Museum, which has the world's largest collection of fish otoliths. And this is because NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, did I get that right? Okay, good. I should know that off by heart because they've been very good to me. But they send all the otoliths are all stored there in boxes. And in fact, I called them up and I said, I'm doing this thing about fish ears and I'd love to see this collection. And they said, sure, absolutely, come on down. They were very nice. That's where I got these pictures. It's a grenadier and a hake. And I was in the lab and I was looking around. I was like, okay, this is great, but I don't really see how it's the largest collection. And they said, oh, well, we'll walk you through the annex. And I said, oh, okay, that's great, thank you. And they walked me out, and it's like in that Indiana Jones movie where they're putting the cart into the back of the warehouse, open up these huge doors, and it's just boxes and shelves back as far as you could see, and it was all just boxes of fish ears. And every single one of them was labeled with the fish, where it was caught, the date it was caught, the boat it was caught on, and all of that data. So that actually allows scientists, should they ever have reason to look at it, to go back and figure out the conditions of the water where that fish swam. So it's kind of a really amazing little research tool. Also, incidentally, it's ear bone, which is how it hears. And yes, fish do hear. Same basic principle as a statocyst. So these sorts of ears and statocysts generally tap into low, loud sounds, but some fish have actually sort of specialized in hearing and evolved additional structures that let them hear even better. So some of them have actually fish that have swim-bladders, so that's a sac inside them that they fill and empty with air that allows them to help control their buoyancy. Some fish have actually developed prongs of their swim bladder that extend up through their bodies and almost to their ears, so that the vibrations from sound moving through their bodies and vibrating their swim bladders gets transmitted directly to their ears as well. And that can help give them even more sensitive hearing and often higher frequency hearing. And there's other little structures that fish have evolved. Even fish that don't make sounds, goldfish are hearing specialists. They hear very well up to, I believe, it's about 300 kilohertz, and they don't even make sounds. So they just are really, really, really good at listening to the environment around them. There's a lot more to say about fish hearing. It furnished some of the most extensive and complex research. I had about 4 chapters about fish hearing that I wrote that my publisher probably somewhat wisely suggested that I cut. But I think that the reason why fish hearing captured me quite so much was because the discovery of fish hearing actually illustrated a principle. It illustrated the principle that the human ear was not the only way to detect sound. It wasn't the only way to hear. And this was a huge debate between the behaviorists who would watch an animal, see what it did, and then deduce what it could do based on what it did, and the anatomists who would look at an animal, look at what parts it had, and then deduce what it could do based on what parts it had. And so the anatomists looked at the fish ear and said, well, it doesn't have a cochlea, it doesn't have an ear like ours, so therefore it absolutely can't hear. And whatever it's doing when it reacts to sound, it's something else. And then the behaviorists would say, but it's clearly detecting the sound, so something must be going on. So I'd like to give you a short second reading, just because this was one of my favorite parts of the book to research, and as historical society folks, I hope you will appreciate how amusing and awesome some of it is. So essentially, in 1762, John Hunter was strolling around a fish pond in a noble friend's Portuguese garden. Hunter was a fellow of the Royal Society of London, which was at that moment disputing fish hearing. Hunter realized he could conduct an impromptu experiment. He asked a gentleman who was with him to hide behind some shrubbery so that the fish couldn't see him, and then fire a gun. He did so. Hunter watched the fish flee to the bottom of the pond in a muddy cloud. Fish, Hunter informed the Royal Society, could hear. But one shotgun blast does not a debate settle. Most scientists accepted that dolphins and whales could hear, and assumed that ocean invertebrates could not. But fish were puzzling. They lacked a cochlea, but seemed to react to some sounds. If they were hearing, it meant the cochlea, or the human ear, is not the only way to hear. Either way, it affected our understanding of the sense of hearing and how fish fit into the scientific tree of life. Other scientists tried another tack and removed the tubes in lampreys' inner ears. The lampreys didn't respond differently to sound, but they did have trouble orienting. Austrian physiologist in 1896, Alois Creedle, who heard tell that trout at a market pond could come and be fed at the sound of a bell, put some goldfish in a tank and then rang a bell and blew a whistle beside the tank. Nothing. They did react to banging on the tank, clapping, and a gunshot. He poisoned them lightly with strychnine. Their reactions became more sensitive. He removed their inner ears. No change in response to the sound, except they seemed disoriented. So Creedle concluded that fish did not hear. If they did sense sound, it was with some other body part, perhaps some other sense on their skin. In the early 20th century, scientists subjected fish to car noise, whistles, knocking, annoying children's toys, all with ambiguous results. Beginning in 1909, Harvard biologist George Parker did a series of experiments on dogfish, which is a kind of shark. He swung a pendulum at the wooden walls of a fish tank, measuring if the dogfish shark inside reacted. He cut the nerves connecting the ear and the lateral line, and even finally numbed the animal's skin with cocaine in case the skin was feeling vibrations. Having eliminated every other clue, Parker suggested that sharks could hear. Finally, German ethologist Karl von Frisch, not fish, Frisch, who is perhaps best known for discovering bees' flight patterns, or also called the waggle dance. Years before that work, sorry, I just completely skipped over a sentence there. Let me start that again. German ethologist Karl von Frisch is perhaps best known for discovering how bees' flight patterns, also called a waggle dance, communicated the location of food to the hive. But years before this work, in 1921, von Frisch came to work at Rostock University on the Baltic Sea, where he became interested in fish hearing. Rostock's ear clinic was directed by one Professor Otto Korner, a researcher who studied catfish and was firmly in the fish are deaf camp. Frisch's interest was piqued. The fact that a principle was involved explains the heat engendered by this controversy, he wrote. The principle in question, as it had been for so long, was whether fish could hear without a cochlea, and so prove that the little spiral in our own ears was not the only way to do so. Korner had exposed his catfish to various sounds, even summoning a famous soprano to serenade the tank. Presumably, the fish would respond, but nada. Frisch thought this was short-sighted. If he were a fish, he might not respond either. It was the kind of oversight that a good behaviorist must account for. An animal doesn't react to every stimulus, just the ones that relate to its ongoing survival. Opera wasn't relevant to a fish. Food was. So Frisch got his own catfish, christened him Zverl, and took out his eyes. He put a hollow candlestick in the tank as an ersatz home for the little blind fellow. Quote, Each day for several days, he lowered a piece of meat into Zavrl's tank while ringing a bell. The fish smelled the meat and came out to eat. After 6 days, Frisch rang the bell, sans meat. Zavrl, with no clue but the sound, swam out of his candlestick to eat. Frisch invited Professor Corner to see. Quote, "Well, the kindly old gentleman sat in front of the aquarium waiting for the experiment he was convinced could not succeed. I went to the furthest corner of the room and gave a soft whistle. Zavrl at once came out of his tube, and at the same time the professor, almost visibly deflated, could be heard to say reluctantly, 'There is no doubt, the fish comes when you whistle.'" End quote. Frisch published his work in 1936, and his students at Munich's Zoological Institute took up fish training. To avoid cross-contaminating training cues, students scattered their tanks in various departments, and signs throughout the building exhorted people not to whistle or sing, please, lest the sounds can confuse the fish. There's so much. Carl von Frisch, fascinating guy, by the way. His autobiography is called A Biologist Remembers, and you can find it for free online if you look for a PDF of it. Although if you want to pay for it, please do. It's just a great read about a biologist who discovered a lot of really cool stuff back in the days when you did like 7 different things in your career because you weren't hyper-specialized in something. So recommend that one. Anyways, on with fish ears. Whales and other mammals, they hear as well, obviously. They're a bit of a special case, though. Mammals evolved on land with those same air ears that we have. So when they went back into the water about 50 million years ago, to put it crudely, they then had to evolve water-adapted versions of their air-adapted ears. And the way that they did that was, rather than go through the whole eardrum, middle ear thing, they instead actually whales and dolphins seem to have evolved the way that they detect sound with their jaws. They have pockets of fat in their jaw bones, and it seems that what that does is it detects the sound, and then it channels the sound through the fat and the bone and the jaws directly up into the fluid-filled inner ear. Kind of like the same way that when we're underwater, the sound travels through our skulls into our inner ear. Whales and dolphins seem to do a version of that with a modified jawbone and some very complex, hard little bones in the back of their heads. But they seem to have re-evolved a water ear, and that's how they hear in water. So now we know what sound is, and we know why and how most animals can tap in. But how do they actually use sound? Why and how do they actually use sound? Well, a big reason, probably one of the biggest reasons, was auditory scene analysis, or in other words, finding out what's going on around you behind just what you can touch. This tells you where your prey is. It tells you if you're about to become prey. It means it tells you where you are. It tells you where your food is. Even invertebrates that don't make noise, they likely hear sound, or the reason why so many animals who don't make sound still find a reason to hear sound likely has to do with simply that huge advantage of being able to find out about the world around you going on around you. And as we've seen underwater, sound is the best information channel to do that. And so even it's really, really important to do that. Sort of tacked into that same reason is echolocation, which we don't have a huge amount of time to get into tonight, but which mammals can do, and quite possibly some fish too, although I haven't quite studied that one too much. But that's sending out sound and then reading from the echoes things about your surroundings. So how far away something is, whether it's moving or accelerating, Doppler effects, all that kind of stuff. So there's analyzing a scene, there's finding out what's going on, and then the lower 4 of those all kind of fall under this umbrella of communication. So there's that category kind of covers a lot, from staying in touch with others, finding and coordinating a mate, identifying yourself and your family, defending yourself, scaring off enemies. These are all things that animals really need to do in order to survive, and because sound is so useful underwater, animals lean on sound more underwater for a lot of these things. So invertebrates don't make a lot of sound, but there are some that use sound for aggression and for defense. For example, pistol shrimp, you may have heard of. They're a type of shrimp that has an extremely overpowered claw. We'll listen to some of them later, but they can clap their claw closed really, really fast, and it kind of flash boils a little bit of water and creates a bubble that then pops and creates a very loud bang. And as a group all together, when you have a field of pistol shrimp, it kind of sounds like bacon frying, or like they called it crackle in some of the early sonar listening manuals. And they've just discovered as well that there's a polychaete marine worm that does the same thing with its jaws to fight as well. They've just discovered this up in British Columbia. They go, but much, much, much louder than that, to fight. And that's how they defend their territory, and that's how they drive off enemies. So fish make a huge variety of sounds. You may think fish are silent, but they're not. So far back, approximately 20 or 30% of fish have been auditioned and found to be soniferous, which is the fancy name for fish that make sounds. But we honestly don't really know the real proportion. What we do know is that soniferous fish are found, it's not just like one family or one group, it's all over all different groups and families of fish. So clearly it's something that it's evolutionarily beneficial to have for many of these animals. There's about close to 1,000, if not 1,000 species that are confirmed to be soniferous. The actual number is probably a lot higher. Some fish only make sound at certain times or places, but they do. Fish actually have the widest variety of sound-making apparatuses among vertebrate groups. We have our larynx and our vocal cords. Fish can grind their teeth in their jaws, they can vibrate or pop their swim bladders, they can scrape their gill arches, they can grate their pharyngeal teeth. They have a huge variety of sound-making apparatuses. A lot of the fish sounds were very first cataloged, just as a very short aside, by a scientist called Marie Poland Fish. Yes, her name was Marie Poland Fish. She was back in, to make a long story very, very, very short, it was only around World War II and in the subsequent Cold War that the US and other powers started to really listen underwater because submarine warfare had gone underwater. And because we were listening underwater with new networks of hydrophones, there was this real vested interest in finding out what animals were making sounds, partly just to know what was down there, but partly also because we needed to know what wasn't a Soviet submarine. There's a possibly apocryphal, but I think probably true story of a fin whale makes a very, very monotonous, like boom, 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 boom call. That's like sped up 20 times. Like I can't do an actual fin whale call. It's way too low. But they thought it was a Soviet submarine until a whale researcher popped in and was like, no, it's a whale. So you needed a manual, or you needed a sort of a Audubon Field Guide Society thing so that you knew what wasn't a problem. And that was the driving force in a lot of the first marine bioacoustics research. And Marie Poland Fish was paid by the US Navy in secret to go along the coast, the east coast of North America, and basically wherever she could go and audition fish to find out what sounds they made. Because they knew from experience in Chesapeake Bay that there were species of fish that could call, especially in the spring, very, very loudly and drown out the sounds that might be coming through on the hydrophones. And if there's one place in the US during World War II where you wanted to know what was making that sound, it was the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, where you may or may not be able to get a submarine up to some very important parts of the United States. So this was why we had a lot of that early research. And interestingly enough, it was because of the nature of it, it was actually kept classified for anywhere from a couple to up to 50 years. So one of the big reasons why we are just now seeing so much research into the sounds that animals make underwater is because a lot of the wider biological research community didn't actually know about a lot of the listening that was going on. And when these files were kind of declassified circa 1991, 1992, the end of the Cold War, there was this whole slew of information. And a lot of scientists, including a lot of the ones I spoke to for the book, said, they'd been doing their work and looking at their stuff, and then all of a sudden they saw this data and they were thinking, oh, maybe I should be looking at sound too. And they started incorporating it as sort of an aspect of their research into the underwater world, which I think is actually kind of cool. So a lot of the original research on fish sounds was actually done by the US Navy along the coast, specifically to inform sonar listening tech guides. And you can still find them. They're published. If you look up Marie Poland Fish, her works, you can track them down at most universities. So sound plays a big role in fish fighting, agonistic sounds. Another place where sound plays a big role when it comes to fish is in mating. Not partly to just attract each other, to be able to find each other, as it is to be able to find any animal, any other conspecific in the water. But this is as crude as I'm going to get tonight, but I'm going to do it just because I think it's actually really interesting and important. If you are an animal that has non-penetrative mating, and you want to release two substances at the same time and make sure they mingle in a fluid that's probably moving, you need to coordinate that release so that it actually mingles. So if you're a fish, it's very important that you do that. And a lot of fish that use sound for mating, most spectacularly haddock and cod, will do these very elaborate, up to an hour-long mating swirly dances that have the swirling, but also the sound. And they will coordinate their sounds back and forth until they can tell, they kind of keep track of each other and know where they're at, kind of thing. So they can successfully mate. And that's why fish use sound, so, well, not why they use it, but it's one of the reasons why sound is one of the, you know what I'm trying to say. I'm not going to go any further into that, except to say I'm sure you can figure out what I'm trying to say. Fish use sound for a lot of things, and they also use sound quite a lot for hearing predators. As far as fish listening for prey, they certainly do that too, but fish also listen for predators. And in fact, there's some work that's been done on herring that finds that when they hear the sounds of a particular kind of whale, specifically the killer whales and humpback whales, at a particular frequency, they know that they're being hunted, and they empty their swim bladders with something called scientists they'll find an acronym in anything. They call this a fast repetitive tick, or a FRT, abbreviated to fart. Sorry. And they will sink, and that does two things. One, it kind of takes them down out of the water to try to escape from the whales. But the other thing it does is because they have less air in their swim bladder, they're less reflective to the killer whale sonar. Because as you recall, the difference between air and water, it tends to reflect sound. And one of the big advantages of having echolocation is that it pings off an animal when that animal has air inside of it. So one of the fish's defense for echolocation is to empty its swim bladder and become more acoustically transparent. And herring have learned to do this. So fish are using their hearing for all sorts of things. It's quite amazing. And that's just a little bit of a brush on this. A lot of ink has been spilled about whale sounds and song, which are indeed beautiful, but one of the key things that I came to understand about whales and their sound is that song is just a very, very small part of their vocal repertoire. And even then, it's only done by baleen whales, one of the two major groups of whales, and tends to be only done by males and only at certain times a year. Then the other group of whales, toothed whales, they don't sing, but they can echolocate, which is what baleen whales don't do. However, all whales make a whole array of what we can sort of loosely call vocalizations. And to me, these are the most interesting because it's the kind of day-to-day. And it's also where we find things like codas and dialects, which are where whales define their identity. So whales are mammals, and mammals by definition have social bonds. Whether it's just a mother and a calf or it's a big family group, these bonds come in many, many forms. But what became clear to me as I was researching this was that, you know, mammals, whatever mammal you find, mediates its social bonds many, many different ways. But the way that whales do this is with sound. Dolphins have evolved individual signature whistles. You may have heard of this. Each individual dolphin will develop a whistle that's basically its name. I'm only using that word because the scientist who explained it to me used the word as it's an acceptable simplification, and I learned to be very careful about what I said or whatever about this whole thing. But it is kind of like its name. It develops, and then that's the dolphin's name throughout the rest of its life. Then there's killer whale pods. Killer whales are matrilineal family groups, and they have dialects of there's a group of calls they make called pulsed calls, and each matrilineal pod will have its own dialect unique to that pod. And that's how groups of killer whales that they may be from, you know, this group can live here and another group can live in the same area. You'll have them geographically all together, but within that apparent bunch of killer whales, there's distinct families that don't breed with each other, that hunt totally different food, that have completely different cultures, and they define their identity by their dialects of pulsed calls. They know who they are and who they are individually because of the sounds that they make. And they teach each other those sounds as they get older. And then most whales have some form of a so-called contact call. So that's the equivalent of just like, hi, it's me, I'm here. A contact call by itself isn't super sophisticated. A lot of animals have contact calls. But one of the things about whales that's really interesting when it comes to contact calls is we're starting to listen very, very closely to the acoustic nuances of contact calls in animals like belugas. And we're discovering that there's acoustic features in there that may also function as a form of a dialect or possibly even signature whistles. That research is still being done right now, but it just goes to show you how complex this stuff can get. And then something Another thing that animals use sound for is to keep in touch over distances. And when you have a social group, and when you have a very important social group, that becomes more and more important, especially when you can't see as far as a human can see. And so in other cases, some cases, that's the so-called acoustic herd hypothesis. But in other cases, this actually quite literally means that the animals are able to stay alive. So this is an interesting picture, and I wanted to show it to you guys because it illustrates something that kind of blew my mind when I saw it. So I went up to Cook Inlet in Alaska a few years ago to do some research, or to do a story on the beluga whales that live there. And if you've never been to Cook Inlet in Alaska, it's the water there is absolutely opaque. It's like chocolate milk or like a latte. It's like you put your hand in it, you can't see your hand. And that's because there's so much silt washing down from the mountains and all the streams, and there's huge tides there, like Bay of Fundy level tides that just keep it churned up all the time. It's actually kind of a scary place to boat. But we were out there on a calm day, thank goodness. And so we're out there with a group of belugas, and they were just kind of hanging out waiting for the tide to turn. And we were sitting in the boat. This is like the depth finder, the sonar under the boat. You can see we're in about 5.5 feet of water or so. And so that's, I don't know, I'm 5'7", so there's me right there, I guess. And so this is scanning down the boat, and there's a group of young whales under the boat. And there's all these little, all of a sudden the shape moves under the boat. And the researchers, right before he turned it off, because he didn't want the sound to bother them, he saw him, he was like, oh yeah, I think that's a calf. And I think you can see here, I can't confirm this, no way you could confirm it, but he said it. So you kind of see a head here and the little tail coming down like this. And they're very small when they're born. These newborn belugas are quite small. They can grow to about 12, 18 feet as adults, but they're fairly small when they're young. And it just struck me, this water is opaque. Like you can't see anything. If you're a newborn calf, which this group of belugas was, and you need to stay with your mother for 2 years, because belugas do nurse for 2 years, and you lose her, whales don't have arms. They can't hold their babies. They do it with sound. Mother and calf murmur contact calls to each other constantly. They're constantly saying that they make little contact calls. If you put a hydrophone in a tank with tank or ocean, preferably an ocean, or not at all, but you hear they're just very quietly back and forth to each other to stay in touch. And looking at that chocolate milk water, I was just sitting there going, if they didn't have sound, how would they ever find each other? You've got this current going so crazy that we can't even dock our boat. You certainly can't see. And in fact, it's not just belugas. Humpback whales do this too. Whale parents, they don't hold their babies, they murmur to them. And it's very quiet, and it's quite vital. And it's just one more example of the sort of sound that becomes about survival. And if you can't hear it, that's an extremely large problem. It's not just a question of, oh, that's annoying, I can't hear that. It's like, I've literally lost my calf. So you can start to see how important some of these things can become. So now we can start to see why human noise can be a little problematic. We can start to fill in that little gap of understanding, which I had when I would read stories about, naval sonar or underwater noise or shipping noise. I would just have this little blip where I would think, if you think about something like an oil spill or microplastics, you can see it, you can visualize it, you can kind of understand it. But when you'd hear about underwater sound being a problem for animals, there was just a little, I would think, that big of a problem, really? Like, how can it have that much of an effect? But if you start to see that the more you rely on sound, the more you lose if you can't hear. This is just one example of the sort of thing that can happen. But if you're relying on sound to find mates, and that's, maybe not hurt you individually, but it's certainly going to hurt your species. If you can't hear predators coming, if you can't see your prey, if you can't keep in touch with your family in murky water, that's going to become a very large problem. So I'm just going to go sort of quickly through this idea in case you're curious about sort of how we can look at the idea of a threat and how most regulators will look at the idea of a threat. So generally speaking, this whole issue of underwater noise and underwater sound, humans make quite a lot of it. And what we make can kind of be very roughly divided into two categories. There's kind of low, chronic, constant sound like shipping and motorboats, and then there's sort of short, sharp, very loud, intense sounds like sonar, seismic air guns, and pile driving. And those two sounds, we divide them into those categories mostly because the characteristics of the sound means that you can kind of understand how they might affect an animal somewhat similarly. But at the end of the day, the way that scientists and now regulators are starting to think about this is that very, very close to the source of the sound, you have a zone of impact or a zone of influence where you're going to have injury or hearing loss. Move a little bit further out, you're going to get maybe temporary hearing loss. Past that, you're going to change the animal's behavior. A little bit further out from that, you're going to mask important sounds. A little bit further out from that, the animal may not react, but it can hear it. It might shrink the space in which it can hear something. And then beyond that, it's not going to hear it. So this is sort of the model in which you can think of noise pollution and noise as a problem. Noise, by the way, is a technical term. It means an unwanted sound that interferes with a signal, which means that noise, when we say noise, it's actually kind of complex because what a noise can be a noise for one animal, but not a noise for another. Something that bothers a dolphin that has a hearing that's centered at 50 kilohertz is not going to bother a squid, which is centered at 120 hertz, and vice versa. Something like a pile driver might really send out vibrations and very low sounds that might really upset a salmon, but killer whale doesn't care. So in order to know whether a sound is bothering an animal, let alone how you might want to regulate something, you need to know those animals' hearing ranges and sensitivities. You need to know how far away it is. You need to know what the ambient sound of the ocean is, and you kind of need to know what the sound means to the animal. One of the things that we found is that mid-frequency naval sonar makes a boing sound that seems very similar to a particular call that minke whales make. So one of the reasons minke whales are particularly affected by naval sonar is because it seems to mimic a particular call that they make. So just knowing that is the kind of thing that we need to learn more about. Most of the research to date has been on marine mammals, for obvious reasons, but because we're just starting to realize how important sound is for other animals and how they use it, let alone that they can even detect it. Like, we didn't even think that squid could detect sound until the last couple decades. Although we had guesses before that, but mostly in octopuses, and that's a different story. But now that we're starting to see that this could have impacts, now we're starting to ask these sorts of questions. And we're also starting to ask questions about animals that can move away from sound versus animals that can't move away from sound. For example, one of the studies that's been done recently has found that lobsters that live under a shipping lane show a certain amount of trauma to the hair cells in their statocysts. They're still able to function, but it's physically noticeable in their hair cells, and it's because lobsters can move, but not that far, that fast. And so just the chronic, it's like working in a factory for so many years, it just starts to wear it down. Some invertebrates can regenerate their hair cells, mammals can't regenerate their hair cells. So it's very complex. So when you say that sound underwater is a problem for animals, that's broadly true, but it's also really good to know what animal you're talking about, where, when, what's the noise source, how far away is it, that sort of thing. So, and I will say that I spoke to a lot of scientists for this book, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert in this topic or that I know everything there is to know about regulating underwater noise, but I will say that most of the scientists I spoke to acknowledged that the sort of very loud, sharp, horrible noises were horrible, but that globally, shipping is very much the big problem. Shipping noise energy in the ocean has doubled every decade from 1960 to the early 2000s. There's some evidence it's leveling out now. That may just be because ships are getting bigger, thanks to economies of scale, containerization. But you can hear ships in every part of the ocean. You can hear ships at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. They run 24/7 and you can't get away from them. So that 1963 graph, when you see the noise, that was from 1963. It's 400 or 500 times that now and still growing because, that's what's happening. So there's some efforts to make a change here. And one of the things that gives me a little bit of optimism about this is that when it comes to stopping this problem, if it is a problem in a certain place or for a certain species, if you think of something like oil, we're still cleaning up oil spills from decades ago. But for ships, you can have long-term impacts. But if you can figure out how to just be quiet, it does kind of stop it kind of quickly. As far as pollutants go, it's I'm not going to say one of the easier ones to tackle, but it is one that's possible to tackle, and one that many shipping companies actually want to tackle in a lot of ways. I spoke to some people from the shipping company Maersk, and they are, because noise equals inefficiency in a machine, they have a vested interest in making quieter ships, because a quieter ship is a more efficient ship. Now, it's not that simple. You have to re-engineer the whole ship, but they do want to do that because they're looking for efficiency ultimately and cost effectiveness. So it's not going to be easy, but there are good reasons to quiet a ship down, and they're actually coming up with new innovations like a boss cap propeller, a boss cap on a propeller. The propeller is where a lot of noise is generated on a ship, and if you change the hydrodynamics of the water around the propeller, you can increase the efficiency and decrease the noise, which actually also saves the steel, because the cavitation that creates the noise creates pits in the steel, and it's a whole other thing. Naval architecture is fascinating. It's another rabbit hole I strongly recommend you fall down at some point. If you're not already fallen down it, it's amazing, and I really wish I could have gotten deeper into it. But suffice it to say, then there's also efforts to slow down. A slower ship is a quieter ship. There's some question about whether or not that is, if every ship that's going into a certain port has to slow down, it's not uncompetitive. There is some success in those efforts. There's also shifting a shipping lane away from very sensitive areas. Again, this is mostly focused on marine mammals, but now that we know more about the other animals that are in the ocean, we can start asking these questions too. Finally, what I'd like to do is talk about the idea of why we should listen underwater. Listening underwater, there's a lot of research going on right now about individual animals, their hearing ranges. For all these reasons, we need to know these sorts of things to make good regulations. Research on animals' hearing range, frequency sensitivity, how they react to a given sounds, obvious uses for conservation. But there's actually a lot of promise in the idea of using sound as or so-called passive acoustic listening, if you want to use the fancy word, to be able to listen to the ocean and listen to soundscapes underwater in great detail. And this is really, really useful for places that are really hard to reach, like the Arctic or the deep sea, or just when you don't have a lot of manpower over a large area, or for long periods of time. One of the fellows that I spoke to is using passive acoustic monitoring up in the Arctic, where he's got a recorder out year-round in what will be, or is, the current route of the Northwest Passage off the coast of Ulakaktuk. And that's going to give you a baseline of what the soundscape there is like naturally before there's any shipping, so that now you can know what animals are there, and that's monitoring that, going up to the Arctic is and getting a scientific expedition up there, getting scientific equipment up there is a whole thing, and being able to have sound that you can analyze is invaluable. And so this is a double-edged sword, though, because in a lot of ways, there's some things that listening does tell us, and there's some things that it doesn't tell us. Listening to sound underwater can tell us whether a species is present or absent in the ecosystem. It can tell us daily patterns in the sound. It can tell us how loud something is. It can tell us if there's something there that we really don't want to be there. One of my favorite examples of that was when I was listening to Ocean Networks Canada's hydrophones, where there's cruise ships going through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, where I live in BC. And one of the ships going through was making just the most gosh almighty shrieking noise. And there was nothing about it that would indicate that there was anything wrong with it, except the tech that I was working with said, oh, it's got a rope wrapped around its propeller. And so they could tell the ship, they called the ship and they said, we think you have a rope wrapped around your propeller. And they were like, oh, geez, thank you, good to know. And so what they've actually found with a lot of ships, interestingly enough, is that a lot of the noise is made by sort of a handful of them that are in exceptionally poor repair as well. Like, the whole thing is a problem, but some of them are really a problem. And if you can find those out underwater and do something about it, that's pretty cool. What listening underwater doesn't tell us, it doesn't really tell us what a sound means to an animal, and it doesn't really tell us how many are there. Is it one really, really loud fish, or is it 6 medium loud fish? Not sure. It doesn't really tell us the context either. You can hear like, but that doesn't tell you if this is a friend, if this is a foe, if this is amorous, like if it's agonistic. It doesn't really tell you any of that stuff. So there's a huge rise in efforts to listen underwater. And I'm really excited by a lot of it. These are some of the pros and cons. What I'd like to tell you, in what I'm now realizing is probably a little bit longer than I wanted to, just very, very quickly. I've talked a lot about marine ecosystems. There is a lot of research in freshwater ecosystems, much, much less, and I think it's very unfair. I think freshwater ecosystems are just starting to get their due. There's a lot of work being done in ponds and rivers and in fish in major river systems. This is a really interesting study because, to my understanding, it's one of the few that's actually been done like it. And it was the first time that someone did a passive acoustic survey of sounds in the Hudson River. So some researchers they put a hydrophone at Tivoli Bay, which is just up the Hudson River, and then they put one in New York City. And they wanted to classify sounds, audition fishes, and figure out what was going on in the Hudson River. And what they found, by the way, this is a boat. This is boat noise compared to fish noise. So you can see the difference in the characteristic of the noise. This is a spectrogram. Just the amount of energy going into the water versus natural noises. That said, the ocean is not a silent world, and neither are rivers, and some fish can get really, really loud. But so one of the things that they found was there was a lot of unknown noises. It's this kind of catch-22 that happens when you start listening underwater. You can hear a lot of things, but you don't always know who's making it. So unless you have somebody like Marie Poland Fish going around classifying everything, it's really hard to know what's going on. So they had a couple of noises on their spectrograms, and they were playing it at some conferences, and a guy came up to them and said, "I think that's a freshwater grunt." Or a sheep's head, I guess. And he said, "Oh, they're not supposed to be in the Hudson. They don't go east of the Appalachians." So the freshwater drum, my bad. So what they discovered was, from this acoustic listening survey, they discovered that the freshwater drum was making sounds all through the Hudson, where it hadn't been recorded doing that before. They had some indication that the drum was in the Hudson. And at this point, I'd like to say, I'm from Ontario, but some of you in this room might be much more familiar with the Hudson watershed and or the species than me, so please jump in and let me know anything else. But basically, some fishermen had found the drum at the mouth of the Hudson, which suggested it was probably in the Hudson watershed, but it wasn't, like, it has the freshwater drum, because it has such a wide distribution, it goes from Hudson's Bay all the way down to Guatemala. They figured if it's in the watershed, it's going to do really, really well, but it just never has been. And so what they did was they went out they recorded the sound of the drum, so they had it verified, and then they went out and they just listened in the water. And when you compare that to other forms of monitoring, it's relatively easy. Like, one guy did it just over the course of a season, and he just went all the way up the Hudson and listened to the drum, and he mapped where it was, and he mapped where it was found and where it was not. And basically what they found was that it seemed to have invaded through the Erie Canal when the Erie Canal was built. And that seems to have been, it's sort of a notification that things can, it's kind of a interesting way of discovering a species where you wouldn't really have noticed that you could have monitored it that way. So there's some promise in the idea of being able to use, like if someone had said, "Oh, we need to go out and find out where in the Hudson River watershed our freshwater drum," the effort of trying to do that any other way is enormous. But with a hydrophone, you can verify it pretty simply. And so that's one of the ways that I thought it was kind of cool, A, to illustrate how you can do this in freshwater, and B, how you can use underwater surveys to get really interesting data. In Lake Erie, I would be curious to know if there's burbot here, freshwater cod. Does anybody know? Okay. They are, I don't know any other word than kind of creepy, but in a good way. They breed under ice in the winter, which is like the darkest thing I can think of and coldest thing I can think of. So they breed in from like December to March, and they use noises to breed. They're a cod, and cod and haddock use noises to coordinate their mating. So imagine in Lake Superior in March, I mean, it's dark in there, so you got to make a sound to find somebody. But yeah, if they are under ice breeders, but they're in the Great Lakes. So are round goby, which I understand are invasive. They make grunting sounds, which have been characterized. They're not known for their sounds, but they do make them. Not as much research done on freshwater as on saltwater, but there's been research onto cichlids, I'm pronouncing that wrong, cichlids in Lake Malawi in Africa. There is research on the soundscape of Lake Baikal because it's got ice and it's got freshwater seals. And there's also been work on piranhas in the Amazon. Piranhas make noises. Who knew? And I talked to the guy who recorded it. He claims that to get the sound, he jumped into the water and just started recording. That's what he said. But sometimes when I find myself getting kind of caught up in the idea of, oh, does it make a sound? Does it make a sound? Even if it's not making a sound, it's almost certainly detecting sounds. So bear that in mind when you think about sound underwater. Everything is listening. All right, I've talked your ear off long enough. I'm going to try to play these sounds for you. And the first one is my absolute favorite underwater sound in the world. And I'm going to just hit play and hopefully it works. Yes. Is a fish in Cape Cod. I recorded and it just stopped. Okay, sorry about that. One sec. Stop, bearded seals. I know you're beautiful, but stop. Okay, here is, I'm going to play you some snapping shrimp. So this is the crackle that the oh, God, come on. Okay. Oh. Let's go to my trusty little laptop here. Yes, the bearded seals are actually an Arctic species, and that's a chorus that was recorded by a passive acoustic hydrophone in the middle of the winter, and that's just a group of seals. Seals! It sounds like some sort of alien that arrived from outer space, but my gosh, it's so beautiful. So no more bearded seals, we're gonna have that. So snapping shrimp. It's all shrimp. Every little crackle is like a claw. And they're all just fighting in a field. And the submarine operators would actually, once they figured out that it was shrimp, they would use the fields of shrimp to mask the sound of their approach whenever they were doing reconnaissance. It's fair to assume that the other submarines were probably doing that too, but we know that at least the Americans did for sure. This is a piranha. Subtle. They just sound like a boom. Such a fearsome fish and such a silly voice. And then, so I also went, so out in Cape Cod in the spring, there's a bunch of species that were supposed to be mating in the spring. And so Cape Cod in the late spring is very busy. There's a lot of boats all over the place. There's paddle boarders above the water. It was summer. There were people tubing. There was motorboats this way, that way, that and the other thing. So I took a paddleboard down the Bass River, which is about just halfway down the lower bit of Cape Cod. And under the water, I heard cusk eels and oyster toadfish attempting to attract mates. And I thought that was really, really cool because on one hand, they're making it work no matter what. On the other hand, I was like, well, do they have a choice? Like, I don't really know if they can go anywhere else. I mean, it's, so I don't know how bothered they were by it, but they were still singing. So you have to maybe listen a little bit carefully. The toadfish is the boopy one. And then if you hear a sound that's kind of like a like a chattering dentures, that's a cusk eel. All right. So that's some of that's what fish sound like. Here's what I found. It was so unimpressive the first time I heard it. I was like, whoa. But once I knew what it meant, it was incredible. And I bought this little dip hydrophone. It just cost me a couple $100. And I just took it with me whenever I was in the water. I took it canoeing, I took it kayaking, paddleboarding. I took it when I was walking around the shore. I'm sure I creeped some people out. I tried to apologize. Just listen to what I heard. I heard water boatmen, like the lake where I swam with my brother. I grew up on that lake. I know that lake front and back. I could have told you every bathymetrical curve in the bottom of that bay, and yet I put the hydrophone in the water and I heard this crackle, and what's that sound? I've never heard this before. They're like, oh, it's water boatmen. I was like, what's a water boatman? I had learned about water boatmen. So it's a whole other world for me, which is just delightful to discover a whole new world in the world when you're, an adult. But also just, it's a world that's like, I find that we find it hard to imagine that it would exist, like I said, but it does exist, and animals use it and they live in it, and that's their world. And I'm so happy that you guys came out here to hear me go on tonight, probably longer than you expected or wanted. And I would absolutely love to, if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. And I will say that I did a lot of deep diving into historical stuff that I did not get to put in the book, as I said. So if for some reason you want to ask more questions about fish hearing or whatever, please feel free to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to send you papers or old books or scanned stuff that you can nerd out on, because I absolutely love that stuff. Fish hearing circa 1700s, people sticking their heads in the Seine River, it's a whole thing. So if you're interested in more of that, please get in touch and I'll give you more than you ever wanted to know about that whole thing. But anyway, just a little bit of quick further reading. Boop. Oh, now it's not going to let me. Well, oh no, you stop. Stop! No! Stop, bearded seals. Stop being so beautiful. There we go, okay. Oh, I had it so good till almost the end, and then I dropped the ball. Anyways, it says docets. That word, if you just type docets into the internet, it'll find it for you. It's a really great resource that was put together by the University of Rhode Island as a plain language primer for anybody who is looking at doing policy or conservation work in this area but didn't know the science of acoustics underwater. So it's really accessible for anybody, I think, if you want to know how a sound works, if you want to know what sounds different animals make, if you want to know what's being done in the US, different areas, different studies. Docets is fantastic, and it's put together by scientists who are really nice. They'll happily answer questions about stuff. Recommend. The Macaulay Sound Library at Cornell University is online. They're trying to make it more online. It's a free library of animal sound recordings. So if you're curious what something sounds like, whether it's below the water or above the water, check them out. Also going to put a little plug in for the New Bedford Whaling Museum. They have a lot of the early recordings from the first people that went out and listened in the St. Lawrence River, and a lot of the early hydrophone recordings from the early hydrophone networks. So the New Bedford Whaling Museum as well, they have a lot of that stuff online. You may have to bother their archivist, who is very, very nice if you're curious. Love them. Props to them. Fishsounds.net is sort of a scientific database if you're doing any actual research. It's sort of verified sounds of known species that have been auditioned. And Ocean Networks Canada is a Canadian hydrophone network that has a SoundCloud channel. So if you're interested in that, you can go. They have everything from a fin whale that shuts up when there's an earthquake, to this is what a glass sponge reef soundscape sounds like, to this is what naval sonar sounds like, to this is what a cruise ship with a rope around its propeller sounds like. So go fall down some rabbit holes. It's truly beautiful. Truly, truly beautiful. I know and the last thing I'll say is, I haven't talked very much about whales, I don't think, but I hope that just illustrates how much I kind of almost want to call the book Beyond Whales, not to not give them their due, but there's just so much else going on out there, and there's a lot of active research. So I hope you're as excited about it as I am. I actually have a lot of reason to be optimistic about this one, because goodness knows we need it. But there is a lot of discussion, legislation, research happening right now, and I think it's a good thing. So anyways, I'll leave it at that and answer any questions. And huge thank you for having me. I am absolutely delighted to have an excuse to come down here and see the area and learn a little bit more about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Especially on a hot day.
Do we have any questions for the author?
Yeah. I'm happy to send it to you. Until this very second, I didn't even think about putting it on my website. Well, hot diddly, I will do that. But I'm happy to send it to you.
I started the book, but I haven't finished it. Is most of the content that you spoke in here?
There's a notes section at the back. Yeah, all of what I spoke about is in there. And then there's if you get to a section, there's a notes section in the back with references. If for some reason you're like, oh, I don't know what the heck she's talking about and I can't find it, I mean, please email me. I'm open to that. But yeah, it should all be in there, and I'm happy to send this to you.
Are you familiar with Joshua Howard's, it's called the Whales?
How to speak whale?
Oh my gosh. Okay, he's a science writer too.
I know.
Joshua Horowitz.
Yes.
About, it's called The War of the Whales, and it's a true story about a lawyer for the Navy, or a lawyer that was in the Navy, and another whale lover was a scientist, Falcon.
Ken Balcom, yeah. I spoke to him.
Okay, well then, yes.
I think he's, yeah.
Read this book,
Yes.
and all about what they did, and found out about how sonar
Yeah.
things affected the whale.
And that was right. That took place, for those who don't know, it was about an incident where I live in Victoria, British Columbia, is right on the southern tip of Vancouver Island, which is right near the border with the US. And in that area, it's an incredibly busy waterway because you have the ports of Seattle and Vancouver and Tacoma. Then you have the naval bases of Canada's Pacific naval bases at Esquimalt, Esquimalt and Colwood. And then in the U.S., you have Whidbey Island Air Force. You have naval bases also at Whidbey Island. You have a testing and training ground. You have a signal that
Attention library patrons. The time is now 7:45, and the library will be closing in 15 minutes at 8 p.m. Please make your final selections and come to the checkout area.
Anyways, yes, thank you. I did read, that was one of the first books that I read, and it was mind-blowing and very intimidating to read that one for sure. But yeah, anybody else who's curious about specifically naval sonar, check that one out. It's called War of the Whales by Joshua Horowitz, and also check out its references section if you want to nerd out about naval sonar. Yeah?
Some reading about the whales attacking boats.
Yes.
Do you have any comments?
My client has no memory of that. I don't, except to say that whales, they learn culturally. They teach other whales if they find something that works. You find stories of dolphins figuring out how to use sponges, balancing them, or use tools. Dolphins can use tools. They figure out how to do something fun, and they just like to do it. It's possible they just like to do it. But I'm not sure that I did look into that actually. I was wondering if there's a sound connection. Like, is there a sound that they make right before they attack or something like that? Because there wasn't a clear sound connection, I didn't look into it too much, but I would love to know what they were thinking. I'm sure, I think it's probably just something they kind of like to do. Yeah. Yeah.
Decades ago, I used to work in fish ponds, raising fish for food. And one of the things we had a big giant food container where we would feed them pellets, kind of like dog food.
Yeah.
At one far end of the pond. And if you made noise with it, which we sometimes would do, instead of getting, the entire pond would react. You could see the fish like
Whoa.
start moving towards it. So we knew that sounds, we would do that when we wanted to net them. We would just call them.
So that's so cool.
And then net them. Anyway,
Yes. Yes and yes. And the quick and dirty answer that I can give you is if you look up the work of a guy called Tony Hawkins. He was a guy who worked in Scotland in the 1960s and 70s, and he recorded the first sounds of cod and haddock. The Scottish fisheries people paid him to find out whether or not the boats were making noise that bothered the fish, partly because they wanted to know if the new trawlers were going to have an impact, and partly because they wanted to know to pinpoint the spawning aggregations so they could avoid them. Because one of the problems was that if you have a spawning aggregation of fish, it's really tempting to go in and get them all because it's a giant pile of fish in the same place. But if you do that, you don't have fish the next year. So they wanted to, he said, yeah, there was like some fishermen that just wanted to know like where they could get a lot of fish, but most of them were like, we want to know to avoid it. And so what he did was he characterized the sound of the cod and the haddock, and so they knew to avoid it, and then they would listen for it, and then they would avoid the spawning aggregations. And then also, I think a lot of commercial government fisheries will try to do that, because otherwise you're just going to collapse your stock worse. And then I do believe there has been a lot of work done by Hawkins Associates. You'd probably have to go on a bit of a literature dive, and I'm happy to give you more information later, but they did do a lot of work in about the 70s, because I guess trawlers got louder at about that point, or they had a new kind of net that they were worried was going to make more noise. So they did some research into that. As for whether commercial fishermen today make sounds to attract or whatever fish, my understanding is that most of the sounds that a trawler makes, fish don't really like, so you don't really want to be making too much sound because you're just going to send them away. But I do know that you can use, like any fish finder is going to be ultrasound. So that's another use of sound, if you want to put it that way. But maybe look at Hawkins stuff and ping me if you want more info. And yeah.
We'll just take one more question, then we got to wrap up.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Is there much research on offshore wind turbines?
Yes. Yes, there's a lot of research on it. There is a section in the book. Sorry, which specific type of wind turbine? The offshore, just the offshore? Yeah. So one of the, there's a section in the book specifically about it, and the references are there, and I'm happy to just send them to you as well. But short answer is BOEM, B-O-E-M, the Bureau of Online Energy, whatever, financed a study that did a lot of monitoring around the installation of the Block Island wind turbines when they went in. And that's not a full-size wind farm, but they did monitor it for sound at different distances out, and all those reports are available for free online. You might have to do a little bit of digging, but that's, to my knowledge, the best field research that's been done on the type of sound, the impulsivity of the sound, what species were around, how they reacted. Then they've also done field tests of pile driving and then like placed squid or other animals in cages like X number of distances away and then pile drove. It closely mimics field conditions, because like if you just really quickly, if you imagine like a wave pool, like where waves are all interacting and moving around back and forth, it doesn't look like a wave, it looks like chaos. And so studies that are done in tanks on underwater sound for a lot of very complex math reasons that I don't understand, they're not really true to life in like a free field ocean situation. So what we're realizing now is that a lot of the studies that have been done in aquariums and tanks, they can tell us some things, but they're not necessarily going to be, the animal isn't going to necessarily hear the sound the way that we're recording the sound. So to answer your question, to get a good answer to that, you kind of have to go into the field, and that's really hard to do. And to my knowledge, the BOEM studies that they did are probably the best ones so far. That's not to say they're great, and they were paid for by BOEM. So, and I would also look at who else funded it, but that is data that they did gather. And then there's a lot of work being done by Arthur Popper and Jim Miller at the University of Rhode Island, also on this exact question as relates to animals that live on the seabed and may also be getting substrate vibrations from the pile driving, because there's good research to suggest that animals on the seabed are also getting vibrations that may or may not be hurting them. And I'm happy, again, email me, I'm happy to give you too much info.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending tonight.